When you're working on a project and you're using Git, there are often situations where you have files, directories that you just don't want Git to know about or to track at any point. You want them to be completely ignored. And there's a mechanism for doing this. We can create a particular file called .gitignore. But before we go into that, let's talk about why you might want this. One of the most common situations is if you're working on an application, you're writing code where you're using API keys, credentials, any sort of application secret that is tied potentially to a credit card, like from AWS or some API that you're using, where you don't want those to get out into the world. So you put them in a separate file. And if you push your code up to GitHub, which I realize we haven't talked about, but if you share that code and you make it public, you don't want that file to be included. So you'll still have the file yourself locally, but you don't want Git to track it. Other things include operating system files. So on a Mac, there are these pesky DS store files. They have nothing to do with your project or your code. They just show up in directories. They're system hidden files. So you don't want to track those with Git. There are similar files on Windows with a different name. Other things, log files or any files that are output by your application that could easily be generated again. So if you have an application, when you run it, it generates some, report every single day, and you regenerate that report on demand. You really don't need Git to track that and save that report because you can regenerate that report, if that makes sense. And then lastly, a really common scenario is dependencies or packages. So if you've ever worked with Node or Python or really any language, and you work with a bunch of dependencies that you download and install, those do not need to be tracked by Git. That could be hundreds or maybe thousands of different folders and files that you can easily go and get at any point. You don't need to bother tracking the dependencies themselves. So I'm going to show you an example of how we do this. As I mentioned, the mechanism is through this file with a very particular name. It's a hidden file that we create, .gitignore. And if we put that really anywhere in a repository, but traditionally we'll put it in the root of the repository, the top of it, although it doesn't have to be there. We create a file with that name. Git will look for that file. And inside of it, we can tell Git what to ignore. So we can put exact file names. So the first bullet point here is .dsstore. Git will ignore a file with that name. We can give it folder names by putting a slash at the end. And we can also do fancier patterns. For example, this line here, *.log. This is a wildcard that will match anything. I think anything except for a slash. It will match any character followed by the extension .log. So this allows you to tell Git, ignore all log files. I don't want to have to write them out. I don't know what their names will be. Just anything with .log. So I'll just quickly show you some examples. Again, we haven't really gone into GitHub at all, but on GitHub there are projects, and pretty much every single project here is going to have a .gitignore file. And inside, we see some of what I talked about, dsstore. We see directories like the reports directory, Node modules. If you ever work with Node, that's where all the packages are installed. So we're ignoring that. Here's another example, the app Signal, if you're familiar with that. Gitignore, there it is. And there's stuff in here, particular files and folder names. They're different because this is an Android application versus Faker I was showing you as a JavaScript app. Here's TensorFlow, another really popular open source project. Inside of here, gitignore, right? And then we see similar stuff, but now some Python specific files and folders that they're telling Git to always ignore. So I'm going to demonstrate this. And to do this, I'm actually going to make a new repository. It doesn't really make sense to ignore things in my novel. Maybe it does, but I'm just going to make a new demo and make a simple Node application. So I'm not in a Git repository now. I'm going to make a directory. I'll just call this gitignore demo. I'll cd in there. I'll type git status. Okay, good. It's not one yet, but now I'm going to initialize git init. And I'm going to run npm init so that I can use some Node packages in here. So if you're not familiar with Node, it really doesn't matter at this point. I'm just going to install some stuff and I'm going to ignore it. But you can ignore any other files using the same stuff that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to make a file. I'll pretend, to write a basic JavaScript app in here. Index.js. Maybe I'll make a secrets file as well. I'll make it a text file. And then I open it up in my text editor. Let's put some stuff in here. So my index.js, I'm just going to write some very basic JavaScript code like console.log, hello world. All right, so whatever, this is my application code. Then I'll have some secret like API key equals, let's just say that's some secret key I don't want anyone to know about, but I need it for my app. And then let's go ahead and make our first commit. So it would be nice if I could make a commit and just do git add dot, but I can't because that will include secrets.txt. So I need to add the index first, and then I'll also add my package.json, which is a generated file from Node, and then I'll commit, start project or something. Doesn't matter what. Okay, and of course, we still have this file that's untracked, and we want it to stay that way. We don't want it to be tracked. So if I do some more work in here, I'm just gonna copy that a couple times. We'll pretend I just wrote a lot of code. Then I'm gonna head over here again to my terminal, and I need to add that change, but I can't do git add dot. I need to add just the index.js, right? And then I can commit again, add new feature. This is a horrible commit message, but pretend it's not. All right, so now I'm going to go and install something with npm. I'll install React. I'm using npm in here, and we can see I have a new directory, node modules, and it has React in there and some of React's dependencies. So if I type git status now, it also notices that node modules now exists, and my secrets file is still there. There's this thing called package.lock.json. The package.json is modified, which I'm cool with. I want to track that. That's where the dependencies are listed. So it tells anybody who gets this code, I need React, but we don't actually need to track the folder that includes React. We can always go get that whenever necessary. So now let's add in our gitignore file so that this will be ignored. I'm going to make a new file. I can do it from here. I'll just do it from the command line, I guess, to be consistent. touch.gitignore. And as I mentioned, it's conventional to put it in the root of your project directory. So now I have that file. And then in here, I can write certain files and patterns that I want to be ignored. So for example, I don't know if there's a dsstore file in here. No, there's not at the moment, but I don't know why it pops up, but sometimes it just does. So I'm saying ignore that. Please also ignore the exact file, secrets.txt. That's the name of the file. And the node modules directory. So I need a slash. If it's just node modules like this, it thinks it's a file. This tells Git it's a directory, node modules. So over here, if I type git status now, whoa, look at that. Very different. Now, we no longer see, I got rid of it. Unfortunately, I cleared. But earlier, it was tracking node modules and secrets. Now, we just see gitignore, because we did change that file and it exists. We want to track the gitignore file. Then also this package lock.json. And that's fine to track with Git. So now I can just do things like git add dot if I wanted to. And I can commit, and then I can make some commit message. In this case, it doesn't really matter. I haven't done any work, but I'll just say, add gitignore file. And now anytime I make changes in those files, if I change my secrets file right there, I'll do something else in here. Let's just add on to that key. I save. Normally Git would notice, but now it says nothing. It's ignoring this file entirely. So there's a lot to writing gitignores, especially for complicated projects. You can have all sorts of stuff in there. And to help out, there are tools online. I'll show you one quickly. This is on the GitHub documentation. They recommend this one site, gitignore.io, where you can specify what you're working in. For example, if you're working on a Python app, this is a recommended starting place for gitignore. And you may not have files with all of these patterns or these extensions or these directory names, but they're common enough that you can just include it. It's really not adding a lot of overhead to your application. And they have similar gitignore templates for JavaScript and pretty much any other thing you can think of. So that's an intro to gitignore files. There's a lot to them, right? The patterns you can write, you can actually go on the Git docs and read about it. There's more that we didn't even go into. For example, 2 stars is different from 1 star. A question mark is a way to match a single character. If you're familiar with regular expressions notation, it's kind of similar here. But anyway, most of the time, it's good enough to just be able to ignore file names, directories, and file extensions using the wildcard. Okay, so that's gitignore.